28 October 1916. One day we were flying, once more guided by Boelcke, against the enemy. We always had a wonderful feeling of security when he was with us. After all, he was the one and only. The weather was very gusty and there were many clouds. There were no aeroplanes about except fighting ones. From a long distance we saw two impertinent Englishmen in the air who actually seemed to enjoy the terrible weather. We were 6 and they were 2. If they had been 20, and if Boelcke had given us the signal to attack, we should not have been at all surprised. The struggle began in the usual way. Boelcke tackled the one and I the other. I had to let go because one of the German machines got in my way. I looked around and noticed Boelcke settling his victim about 200 yards away from me. It was the usual thing. Boelcke would shoot down his enemy and I had to look on. Close to Boelcke flew a good friend of his. It was an interesting struggle. Both men were shooting. It was probable that the Englishman would fall at any moment. Suddenly I noticed an unnatural movement of the two German flying machines. Immediately I thought, collision. I had not yet seen a collision in the air. I had imagined that it would look quite different. In reality, what happened was not a collision. The two machines merely touched one another. However, if two machines go at the tremendous pace of flying machines, the slightest contact has the effect of a violent concussion. Boelcke drew away from his victim and descended in large curves. He did not seem to be falling, but when I saw him descending below me, I noticed that part of his planes had broken off. I could not see what happened afterwards, but in the clouds he lost an entire plane. Now his machine was no longer steerable. It fell accompanied all the time by Boelcke's faithful friend. When we reached home we found the report, "Boelcke is dead," had already arrived. We could scarcely realize it. The greatest pain was, of course, felt by the man who had the misfortune to be involved in the accident. Nothing happens without God's will. That is the only consolation which any of us can put to our souls during this war. My 8th victim. On the 9th of November 1916, I flew towards the enemy with my little comrade Immelman, who then was 18 years old. We were both in Boelcke's squadron of chasing aeroplanes. I had already bagged 7 enemies and Immelman 5. At that time, this was quite a lot. Soon after our arrival at the front, we saw a squadron of bombing aeroplanes. They were coming along with impertinent assurance. They arrived in enormous numbers as was usual during the Somme battle. I think there were about 40 or 50 machines approaching. I cannot give the exact answer. They had selected an object for their bombs not far from our aerodrome. I reached them when they had almost attained their objective. We went to work. I approached the last machine. My first few shots incapacitated the hostile machine gunner. Possibly they had tickled the pilot too. At any rate, he resolved to land with his bombs. I fired a few more shots to accelerate his progress downwards. He fell close to our flying ground in Lanoe. While I was fighting my opponent, Immelman had tackled another Englishman and had brought him down in the same locality. Both of us flew quickly home in order to have a look at the machines we had downed. We jumped into a motor car, drove in the direction where our victims lay, and had to run along a distance through the fields. It was very hot, therefore I unbuttoned all my garments, even the collar and the shirt. I took off my jacket, left my cap in the car, but took with me a big stick. My boots were miry up to the knees. I looked like a tramp. I arrived in the vicinity of my victim. In the meantime, a lot of people had of course gathered around. Major Fokker. I was extremely proud when, one fine day, I was informed that the airman whom I had brought down on the 23rd of November 1916 was the English Immelman. In view of the character of our fight, it was clear to me that I had been tackling a flying champion. One day I was blithely flying to give chase when I noticed 3 Englishmen who also had apparently gone hunting. I noticed that they were ogling me. and as I felt much inclination to have a fight, I did not want to disappoint them. I was flying at a lower altitude. Consequently, I had to wait until one of my English friends tried to drop on me. After a short while on, the three came sailing along and attempted to tackle me in the rear. After firing 5 shots, he had to stop, for I had swerved in a sharp curve. The Englishman tried to catch me up in the rear while I tried to get behind him. So we circled round and round like madmen after one another at an altitude of about 10,000 feet. First, we circled 20 times to the left, and then 30 times to the right, each trying to get behind and above the other. Soon I discovered I was not meeting a beginner. He had not the slightest intention of breaking off the fight. He was traveling in a machine which turned beautifully. However, my own was better at rising than his, and I succeeded at last in getting above and beyond my English waltzing partner. When we had got down to about 6,000 feet without having achieved anything in particular, my opponent ought to have discovered that it was time for him to take his leave. The wind was favorable to me, for it drove us more and more towards the German position. At last we were above Boelcke, about half a mile behind the German front. The impertinent fellow was full of cheek, and when we had got down to about 3,000 feet, he merrily waved to me as if he would say, "Well, how do you do?" The circles which we made around one another were so narrow that their diameter was probably no more than 250 or 300 feet. I had time to take a good look at my opponent. I looked down into his carriage and could see every movement of his head. If he had not had his cap on, I would have noticed what kind of a face he was making. My Englishman was a good sportsman, but by and by the thing became a little too hot for him. He had to decide whether he would land on German ground or whether he would fly back to the English lines. Of course, he tried the latter after having endeavored in vain to escape me by loopings and such like tricks. At that time his first bullets were flying around me, for hitherto neither of us had been able to do any shooting. When he had come down to about 300 feet, he tried to escape by flying in a zigzag course, during which, as is well known, it is difficult for an observer to shoot. That was my most favorable moment. I followed him at an altitude of from 250 feet to 150 feet, firing all the time. The Englishman could not help falling, but the jamming of my gun nearly robbed me of my success. My opponent fell, shot through the head 150 feet behind our line. His machine gun was dug out of the ground, and it ornaments the entrance of my dwelling. End of chapter 8.
Germany asked Tony Fokker, the young aircraft designer, to improve on the French system. And he did just that. The Fokker team synchronized gun and propeller, allowing all the bullets through the blades. They fitted the system to a Fokker single-seater and renamed the plane the E-1. E stood for Eindecker, meaning monoplane. The great German pilot Max Immelmann had the first confirmed victory in an E-1. 3 weeks later, his colleague Oswald Boelcke was successful. Boelcke and Immelmann led what became known as the Fokker Scourge through 1915. Their tally of downed Allied aircraft mounted. The German press created a rivalry between them. Boelcke's approach was simple.
I always wait for the favorable moment and put in a few well-directed shots.
Tony Fokker improved the Eindeckers. This is a scaled-down replica of an E3, the ultimate version. It had a 100-horsepower engine and sometimes 2 machine guns. It appeared in December 1915. Allied fear of the Fokker continued to mount. The Royal Flying Corps issued this order.
Until we are in possession of a machine as good or better than the German Fokker, a machine on reconnaissance must be escorted by at least 3 fighting machines.
But in some ways, Germany squandered the advantage the Fokker gave it. Tactics for fighter aircraft were still to be developed. The Fokkers often hunted alone or in twos. Sometimes, as in this rare film, they took off to provide escort for Aviatik and Argo reconnaissance aircraft. They were held behind German lines to keep the secret of the gun synchronizing system intact. If they'd been organized into strong fighting units, the Fokker Scourge could have been much worse. The Germans didn't have things all their own way in the skies above northern France. Allied fighter aircraft may have been outclassed for the moment, but sometimes pure natural talent could beat new technology.
This bit of film shows an Allied anti-aircraft machine gunner trying to destroy one of our aircraft.
pay. Take the cylinder out of my kidneys, the connecting rod out of my brain, and assemble the engine again.
That was a keen idea! Aim away, Larry! Aim away, Larry!